Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 305. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and today I am here with not one, not two, but three guests. A full house. I think this might be the most people we've ever had on a single call for this podcast. First of all, I have not just the head coach at Island Top Team, but also now I don't think we've talked about this, Rob, an actual world champion, Mr. Rob Biernacki. How's it going, sir?
Like quasi-world champion at best, but it's going all right.
Probably no intros needed from Rob. If you've ever wondered where all of the taint mechanics come from, basically it's just stuff we've lifted from Rob. We've also got two other people from his team on the call here. Cory Burton. Cory, how's it going, my friend?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
And finally, we've got Gary Gilbert on the line, also from Island Top Team. Gary, how is it going?
Going fantastic. Thanks for having me, man.
Nice. So this time we wanted to do something a little bit different. Normally the format here is we grab a guest, they pick a concept or a topic that they want to break down, and we kind of riff back and forth. But today we have the benefit of having pretty much the entire coaching team from Island Top Team on the call. And this is a great opportunity for you guys to have a discussion about the mechanics and the logistics of how things work at your gym. Rob, I'll turn it over to you first because you had a great topic idea that you wanted to introduce, which I think is going to hit hard for people who listen to this podcast. Why don't I just hand this over to you and you can give it a go?
Thank you. I'd be happy to triple team your guests or your listeners with our hard-hitting insertions about coaching.
Thanks, buddy.
No problem. We are going to talk, I guess the plan is going forward that if people enjoy what we have to offer them today, we're going to do more of these talking about different aspects of coaching. So we wanted to kick it off with the topic of coaching language, and probably more specifically, although I'm sure we'll wander off into some divergences. We're going to talk about the idea of coaching language and a common coaching language. So like obviously at Island Top Team, we have a set of concepts and a sort of a taxonomy of both concepts and kind of like technical ideas we all as coaches can draw from. So obviously those are originated with my work, but we've got the online academy, BJJ Concepts, that people kind of all around use, but our coaching staff in particular has that as a resource. So when we bring people on as coaches, we're able to speak to all of our students with essentially the same language. And I think that is a tremendously beneficial thing for our students. And it's just also a beneficial thing for the coaches. But when learning how to coach, one of the issues that people run into is that there's not really a process for creating coaches in jiu-jitsu. People tend to just kind of do whatever their coach did in terms of showing techniques, but in terms of developing a methodology of being a good coach, that's a very underdeveloped area in jiu-jitsu, especially outside of the professional realms. Like obviously if you're on a high-level competition team, there's going to be a methodology because you're all working within the same system. But when it comes to the majority of hobbyist clubs, you've got random coaches on different nights teaching different things, not having a unifying theme and not having a unifying language, which leads to a tremendous lack of quality across the board, or I should say a lack of quality, but although that is true, but a variance in quality. So you got some gyms that will put out very good students here and there, but they'll also put out pretty lousy students depending on whether you go to the morning class, you go to the noon class, you go to one of the evening classes, you go to another evening class, you're going to get some pretty varied results. And so what we're trying to do is even that out and have a common language that we use at the club.
Rob, something that occurs to me, we've had you on this show many, many times.
Too many times, really, if we're honest.
For those who don't know, on our YouTube channel, I have a whole playlist of just like Rob's incidents where he's come onto the podcast. And yes, definitely, I think you must hold the record for most frequently appearing guest. But most of the time when you come on, it's with the intent of Rob's got a concept that's going to be valuable to people and you present that concept. And this time, we actually have the opportunity to talk to you about what goes on at Island Top Team. I don't think we've ever spoken about this, what the structure is like there, how Cory and Gary fit into that. And so I'd love to kind of hear you expand on that and how everyone's roles all interplay and how that ties into this idea of coaching language as well.
Yeah, so I mean, Cory is the Mr. Manager at Island Top Team and is also our kids class instructor and an assistant instructor. So Cory will teach some of the noon classes and I basically teach the evening classes, and then Gary teaches the morning classes and runs some of the open mats on the weekend. And both Cory and Gary will fill in when I'm off like traipsing around the world or racing cars, and they will teach the classes for me.
Got it. Makes sense. So, I mean, with all of that said, on the topic of common coaching language here, what you're describing, I mean, honestly, is something that I wish I had all the way up through my journey. I remember when I started at white belt, it was just a real struggle to learn jiu-jitsu because I was in an environment where there was just a revolving door of coaches. There wasn't really a lot of thought put into who's doing what today. Basically, whichever brown or black belt was free at the moment, they would just step in and teach whatever they wanted in their own style. There was no consistency, not just in terms of technique or topics covered, but in terms of the teaching style or the language. And to this day, I find this to be one of the most frustrating things about jiu-jitsu. I am constantly having miscommunications with people because we all just have different terms for basically the same thing. And I find I've had this problem so many times where I have to get someone to sit down and explain to me and take 5 minutes to explain what they're talking about. And then I realize, I know exactly what you're talking about. We just have a different name for that. So the fact that you have a conscious approach to this, I think is awesome. And with that said, I'd love to hear more about this.
All right, so I'm going to kind of throw it to, Cory and Gary, and, one of you guys kind of run with a little bit of how much of an impact or an influence it has on your ability to teach that we have this, A, common language, and B, just like the online resource where we've got all these modules and lessons that we can draw from if need be.
Yeah, like having that online resource to go back to and just sharpen your tools and be like, oh yeah, we talk a ton about frames and levers or posting and everything, and just having the online resource to be able to go back and be like, oh yeah, your post has to be here. Having a common knowledge coming up from like white belt with Rob, we basically stood behind him the whole time, and hearing that stuff day in, day out is really important. But
I think one thing that is really nice here is that at Island Top Team, from day one, when somebody comes in for an intro class, we give them our general concepts, right? Like the thing that everything in jiu-jitsu is made up of is, posture, structure, base, frames, levers, alignment, that kind of stuff. And while that's a lot for maybe an intro person to take in, I usually, when teaching the intro, kind of pre-warn them like, hey, I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you, just so you know, like, this isn't a test. We're not going to come at you with this tomorrow, but I want you to meet these terms as soon as possible so that when they come up later, because everybody here at our school teaches using these ideas, why does my hand go to the end of his wrist here? There's more leverage. We're using the end of the lever, that kind of stuff. And so they get that really nice early introduction to it so that they know that those are the important details for the moves that they're going to learn moving forward for the rest of their kind of jiu-jitsu journey.
Yeah, those are the terms you're going to hear every single day, every single class. Every instructor is going to teach with that language. We're going to feed off of each other with that language. Anytime we follow up with questions, we use that language. So like to fall back on what Gary said in the intro class, when I'm teaching the intro class, I also pre-warn them that they're going to hear this stuff all the time. It's always going to be something that one of the instructors falls back on, and you will understand these concepts a lot sooner than later because you are going to hear them every single class.
And one of the things that I've tried to create here is like the concepts are pretty simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. I know that there are a couple of people that have trained with me who are pretty intelligent people, and they've even said like, oh yeah, when I first came here, base, posture, structure, yeah, super simple. But it actually takes a few years before you like really understand it to a level where, and this is specific to coaching, to a level where when you have to answer a question about it, you're not just repeating a memorized answer. And so like when we create coaches at Island Top Team, when people have asked me like, oh, would you ever hire somebody from outside to teach at Island Top Team? And my answer is like, man, that really depends, because if they're not familiar with our language, if they're not familiar with how we do things, for somebody, even if they're a black belt, even if they're a pretty skillful grappler, if somebody comes to them with a question and their only way of answering it is, well, this is what I like to do, or I would do this or whatever, and they don't understand on a conceptual level what makes something work, then that's not the sort of instruction that I would be happy to pass on to my students. Whereas the guys that have come up with us, they've got the common language, but that common language, like language influences how your brain works. It influences how you are able to understand things. It influences how you are able to express yourself. And so if we didn't have this common language, even if we had, like we've got guys who train at our club that are pretty good at jiu-jitsu, but like, let's face it, they're not the kind of people that would ever make good teachers because their ability to communicate is limited. And universally with those people, it's because they haven't taken the time to really use and understand the language. We've got people who train with us who, despite my efforts, they're still basically move collectors. Like, I want to do this move and I like this move and I'm going to do these moves. And the people that don't really invest in the time and effort to understand the concepts and express them through the language are not people that I would ever take on board as instructors. Whether it's somebody coming from outside the club or somebody like an existing student who just doesn't make that commitment, it's a really easy filtering process for me to consider, like, is this somebody going to make a good coach? So with Cory and Gary, although they both have inherently different communication styles and just ways of speaking, et cetera, because they both have come to it from the perspective of they've been here for years, they understand the language, they understand why things work and why they don't work. And that has made the transition for them from, like, whether it's Cory starting out as an assistant kids class instructor and not really having much of a teaching role, but just being there to help monitor the kids, and then moving up into the head kids class instructor, and then moving up into an assistant instructor in the adult program. And then Gary has taken over from some other coaches and roles that we've had here. And every time that's happened, it's been a level up, right? Like, things have worked better with these guys because of the commitment they've made to having that common language. So yeah, I think it's very, very important. If you're going to have like a good program where part of the quality that you're aiming for is like everybody, whether they come to a morning class, noon class, evening class, whatever, is getting as close to the same level of instruction as possible. Obviously, individual instructors are going to have different degrees of, jiu-jitsu skill. There's going to be bodies of knowledge that are different. But as far as like the vast majority of students in the program, they're getting, whether you ask Gary a question in the morning class, or you ask Cory a question in the noon class, or you ask me a question in the evening class, we're going to explain it through the same framework. And that's going to mean the faith that our students will have in us is going to be higher. And I think that's just a huge benefit.
I think one thing that I found is that the concepts, like, they transcend the move that we're talking about. And so when somebody asks me a question, it's very tempting to, nerd out on jiu-jitsu and be like, and the hand goes exactly here, and this, play into your ego and be like, I have all the answers here. But it's so much more beneficial for the student if you're like, okay, well, what's our goal here? We have somebody in some sort of a choke, let's say it's an anaconda or something, and it's like, why are we moving our legs in this direction? I see that you think that that's where we want to go, but what's the point? We're looking to break their posture here. So then why are we hollowing out our chest as we walk our legs forward? We're defeating the purpose. And so when we talk about the underlying concepts, we don't just teach them in that moment of, hey, here's how to do this particular choke. They get to use that next time they go into a guillotine and go, why aren't I breaking this person's posture? And so that's why I really like these concepts. And from a teaching standpoint, sometimes I catch myself getting too into the weeds of details and having to dial it back and go, we can get to the details. We can get to the cool little nerdy tiny little details, but like those other concepts that they're going to be hearing from everybody, they transcend that position, and it's going to help them when they're just rolling, kind of improvising, and it's also going to help them understand, if I show them this move and then Cory shows them a guillotine the next day, they're going to catch on to that guillotine much faster.
Yeah, and that's a little bit down to it's not just the common language. So when we say language, like obviously we're talking about some of the concepts that we use, and we use the same terminology for our different positions, etc. But when we talk about a language of coaching, we're also talking about like how our classes look, what the format is of our classes, and how much we will across the board use the same format of introducing a concept, explaining, as Gary was just saying, like the why, like this is what is our goal and why is it our goal to do that overall. And then that is reinforced through gamification. So our common language isn't just that we're using the same terms. Our common language of teaching is that we're going to give you an idea, we're going to show you how that idea might apply, and then we're going to have you play games so you can self-organize, right? Like if you listen to us, if you listen to the language that we're using and you follow the format of the class appropriately, you're going to get enough experiences of doing it wrong and will hopefully understand why that is wrong and what could be a better way of doing it through, referring back to the concepts.
We're essentially building questions to answer. We want you to have questions so that we can answer them and help you figure out the concepts quicker, how to break posture, how to open up structure, how to affect alignment, all that stuff.
Yeah, the experience creates the questions, right? So when we do a Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu round for a beginner, let's say we're doing a Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu passing round, right? For a beginner, their ability to create good knee-elbow connection, maintain good structure is going to be really limited. If we didn't do these games and somebody didn't have access to the concepts, their understanding of guard retention as a beginner would be essentially non-existent. They would try to latch onto people right away, right? Like you'd default to half guard or closed guard because when you open your guard, you get your guard passed. And beginners are going to be, failure avoidant rather than trying to explore. So we're creating the opportunity for questions to arise because we're putting you in this position of you're going to get your guard passed because in this game, that's the only option. If you don't develop good framing, good high legs, good grand bees, good knee elbow connection, you're going to get your guard passed. So you're experiencing the question. You will be exposed to the answers, but you're going to have to arrive at when is the appropriate answer, when does the appropriate answer need to be given at this time versus this time? What problem am I solving with the high leg solution? What problem am I solving with the frame and hip escape solution, et cetera, et cetera. So it's beating the point to death, but the common language of not just the concepts, not just the techniques, not just the positions, but how we approach the teaching method through gameplay and solutions and all that is highly, highly beneficial to our students.
I have a quick question, Rob. When it comes to language, I think anyone who's trained in an environment like this sees the value in it. And people who listen to this podcast, they probably do so because they found it's a game changer when someone presents you with a consistent, clear way of explaining what's actually happening in jiu-jitsu, not just reciting the techniques that are going down, but actually explaining the mechanics behind why this works in a language that you can understand. But there's a lot of kind of competing frameworks for that out there. To what extent do you lean on your own frameworks versus to what extent do you kind of grab ideas from other people? And are there ever any times when you look at what other people have presented in terms of their language and you think, I can refine that, I can make it better? I ask this because when you start changing language, you kind of alter the value of that language. And sometimes just creating new terms makes things more confusing because it's just more stuff that people have to memorize. So how do you balance that kind of that act of my language versus the language that people might be bringing in from elsewhere or things you might see off on instructionals on the internet?
Oh, that's a good question. So the easiest answer is it's the old like Bruce Lee quote, which is, absorb what is useful. And so I try to just have you don't want to add for the sake of adding, obviously. When it comes to the language that others use, sometimes it's avoidable, sometimes it isn't, right? Like there are, especially, to give the example of the leg entanglements, the exact same position, which is, we usually refer to as the 411, sometimes call it the saddle. I don't think too many people use the inside Senkaku terminology anymore. And if you're not 10th planet, not too many people use the honey hole, but there's 4 names for the exact same position. So unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, because there's benefits to decentralization, and I don't want to go way off topic here, but I think there's, tremendous value in the fact that jiu-jitsu has, unlike, let's say something like judo, where judo has universal terminology, which is useful, but judo is also under the IJF and it's in the Olympics, which means it's been watered down and neutered to shit. So judo's really not benefited from it's just one governing body. And I would never want a universal governing body for jiu-jitsu because if we had that, for instance, we wouldn't really have like the leg lock game that we do nowadays. Hell, we might not even really have much no-gi, because if it was just IBJJF or nothing, and IBJJF was Olympics, and Olympics caused with the money associated with it meant that everyone would be funneled towards that pathway, there'd be a huge amount of jiu-jitsu that we would have lost. So I think it's super beneficial that we don't have a CJI just happened. So now we've got a different rule set. We've got the ADCC rule set, we've got sub only, we've got IBJJF. They all have their ups and downs or their pluses and minuses, but I think it's better for jiu-jitsu that we have them. So I'm willing to accept the slightly uneven terminology here and there. And so I might use a certain terminology. For the most part, we've got pretty universal terminology for a lot of the positions and submissions in jiu-jitsu. So that tends not to be a huge problem. And because we just refer to this stuff in a more conceptual way, we can still just refer to goals that people are trying to achieve when teaching them. So it doesn't matter as much about the variety of positional names. What does matter, and this is where there's an enhancement, is if I'm trying to describe something. And so, for instance, probably the biggest change in our common language that has occurred recently has been the adoption of the terms complexity and intensity. So I got this terminology from Chris Paynes, who's a UK black belt. I was on his podcast, and we were discussing some of the gamification that we use. And he had this, sliding scale that he uses, and he used the term be like a puzzle designer or like a video game level designer for your training partner. And I found that language to be tremendously helpful. So I've adopted it pretty much whole cloth to refer to how somebody is supposed to engage with their training partner during a round, especially with the gamified rounds. And that's some of the most difficult stuff. I think both Cory and Gary would agree, which is like, how do you get these fucking idiots to not just go ham bone every time they're rolling? And so giving them language like you're going to adjust your intensity or your complexity, never both at the same time, et cetera, has been tremendously helpful. So that's basically how I do it. I try to not get too caught up in the weeds of like, oh, it's, let's add every positional name in the book. That'll just get figured out. Let's just try to add ways of describing our actions in a way that hobbyists can connect to, that helps them train better.
Yeah, I think getting that intensity thing can be kind of hard, but as long as you're like monitoring and paying attention to what the students are doing, which is easier depending on how many students you have in the room, like you just have to constantly monitor and adjust it. I had that this morning where I had a guy look over at me and go, "Oh, was that right?" And I was like, "Well, the technique was right, but I hear you huffing and puffing and we're just doing kind of game round here, so maybe pull that back a little bit."
That's the thing, right? You can kind of tell who's going too hard during those gamified rounds. If you're huffing and puffing at the end of those rounds, you're going too hard. Dial it back 50% is what we always say. You should be only going 50% too.
Yeah, and a lot of time in these like constraint rounds, it's obvious that the round is for one player, right? Like sometimes it's for both sides, but like in a lot of rounds, it's like, well, what did we work on today? We worked on controlling the back. The person escaping the back should probably dial it back a little more than the person trying to control, unless there's some sort of skill disparity there. But I like to try to reinforce that like, whatever we're working on today, that's the skill we're trying to get. And as much as you can still gain something from the other side, if you're the guy winning, quote unquote, this round, and we were working on the opposite side of this, you're probably not being a good training partner, right? We're trying to be their teacher when we do these gamified rounds with them. When you do one of these rounds with somebody, you want to be their teacher, especially if you're on the other side. So you're doing the defensive side of something we just learned that is offensive, let's say.
Because I teach a lot of the beginners in the noon classes, this is one of the biggest issues that I have, is people winning the drill. We really don't want people to win the drill, and people automatically want to fight for every position. They want to win every position. So lots of times I have to slow down the class and say, hey, look, this is for the benefit of the person on bottom. This is for the benefit of the person passing. Remember that. It's not for you to be able to defeat that right now. That's not what we're working on. I'll get questions on the subject at hand, but it will be like, how do I defeat this? It's like, well, if that's what we were working on, then that's what we'd be working on. But we're working on this skill so that we can pass this position or blah, blah, blah. We could take the back from here. Like, we're not working on escaping this right now. And so that's where I have to deal with a lot of those kind of questions and those scenarios at the gym. So I totally understand.
Yeah, and that's where that, again, common coaching terminology. So we were talking about the idea, or both Gary and Cory talk about somebody winning the drill or how this is for the benefit of someone. So we use the term winning the drill. We'll also use the term taking your ball and going home. We use the term intensity and complexity. We use the term you're trying to be your partner's teacher or coach. These are all common terminologies that we use to describe, yes, to beginners, but honestly, even very experienced people need to hear this disturbingly frequently to keep them from going too hard in particular rounds. So we're using common coaching terminology now, no longer to describe a concept, no longer to describe a technique. Now we're using it to describe intention in a round and what kind of result we're trying to yield with our intention. So you can see how pervasive the idea of having a common language can be, and frankly needs to be, because if we're all using totally similar terms to describe the concepts and the techniques, but then we're using vastly different terms to describe the intention that we're trying to get you to have, or the level of intensity that we're trying to get you to have in a round, that would be a gap in our common coaching language that would be ripe for some confusion on the part of our students. So the fact that we even have coaching terminology, common coaching language for things like that, just kind of goes to show how far we've gone in trying to develop this overall commonality.
Something that I'd love to ask you guys about on this topic. I agree with you completely that your choice of language has implications beyond just the moves and the concepts that you teach people. Language is also a powerful tool for affecting people's mindsets and how they choose to train. And I think that's so important because, as you guys mentioned, one of the hardest things to get people to do in jiu-jitsu is calm down and focus on learning instead of trying to win the round. And I think that a lot of coaches deliberately screw themselves here because they co-opt language that makes jiu-jitsu sound more violent and aggressive than it really should be if you're looking at it from a skill development perspective. Many of the gyms that I've been to where really they're just kind of like a meathead fight club, one of the commonalities I observe is the way that they communicate about what they think jiu-jitsu is. I'd be curious to know at Island Top Team, do you guys have any ways that you present the sport or any choices of words that you try to deliberately use or not use because you want to steer people out of that fight club mindset and into a learning lab mindset?
Oh, yeah, we've got quite a few terms, like even just the ones that we touched on just now, which is the idea of don't be the guy who tries to win the drill. Right? Don't be the guy who's taking your ball and going home. What we try to cultivate is an atmosphere of, one of our other phrases is, when we're not fighting each other, we're fighting injuries. We really try to get people to recognize the distinction between what is the purpose of practice and what is the purpose of, competition or an actual fight or a regular day-to-day practice versus a competition practice and all that. So I'm pretty on record across the board in believing that people train way too hard. And I think, that does speak to your question, which is if your common language is about fighting and about fighting in class and not recognizing that class is a means to develop skill, then obviously the atmosphere of your club is going to be based around that. Whereas the overall ethos of our club is we get good results because we try to understand jiu-jitsu. We get good results because we are playing games. So one of our other common language things is, play the game, don't try to win the game, at least in class, right? When we're talking about especially the gamified round. So, jiu-jitsu overall obviously is a game, but when we're adding additional levels of gamification, the idea is that if you play the game and you try to embrace the spirit of the game, which is to develop the skill, there's so many things that we talk about. I know I've given speeches in class that Gary has followed up on. I'll say a couple things, then Gary will add to that, which, we talk to beginners, especially about how little we as the coaches are trying when we roll with them. And they need to have a bit of understanding of the fact that we're there to help them improve. And if they think that we're having competitive rolls, then, that's going to dramatically change the atmosphere of the room. And we don't want to be the kind of coaches that have to show you, hey man, this is how much better I am than you, right? Take it for granted that I'm only going 20 or 30% with you as a coach, as an instructor, when I'm rolling with you. Because if you don't understand that and you start acting like I'm going 100%, then I'm going to have to go 100% with you. And that's going to feel very different than if I'm going 20 or 30%. And so, yeah, we speak a lot to our students about the idea that this is a training environment. It's a learning environment. And there's I would say a subtle and sometimes not so subtle hint of mockery towards the people that are the meatheads and don't understand that. And we want them to really get the point across without having to do the mat check where like, I'm going to staple you into the floor and submit you 12 times in one round. I would rather not have to do that. And so the more subtle way of going about it is just calling you a dingus for trying to win the drill. So I'd say that the language that we use is very centered around A, we're playing a game, B, we're practicing that game. And so if you're the guy who doesn't embrace that, you're going to get somewhat ridiculed.
Yeah, we get better together. I like to reinforce that in rounds too, with like the positive side of it, where if somebody's just moving at a comfortable pace, they're just doing technically correct things. Like if you're a white belt and everything you do is just like technically correct, I'm going to let you submit me like from the start. You're going to pass my guard. You're going to get to wherever you're trying to go to, and you're going to submit me as long as what you're doing along the way is like technical, it's correct, and it's working, right? But if there's, kind of wild movements or you're trying to really force something, it's like I have no incentive to let that happen. I mean, I don't really love getting submitted, but I do love seeing beautiful technique. I do love seeing people improve. And so you get that positive reinforcement of this person gets to go through these movements and then they get to go, oh, that was cool. And it's like explain to them after, be like, yeah, you were doing everything right. So we were just working through it and that was awesome. And they get that benefit of like, well, I'm not just going to try to explode past your guard or do like a cartwheel pass and knee you in the face.
Yeah, that's something that is important to reference after, because sometimes people don't realize that, right? Like there can be the positive reinforcement action-wise of like, I let you do this because you did the correct technical movement. It's also important to give them the negative reinforcement. And I try to make a point of mentioning that after the round. I'll be like, listen, man, like you noticed things were going well. You moved laterally and you got to a leg drag and you did this and you did that and you got past my guard and then you broke your posture. So I guillotined you. Now I wasn't going to guillotine you. I had no intention of doing that. I was just going to let the roll proceed to the next technically appropriate place. But you did 5 good things in a row and then you did one really, really bad thing. And I had to make you pay for that one bad thing because I didn't want you to walk away from the round feeling like, oh, I got this success without being checked on the failure. So there's the positive reinforcement of you get to go wherever your correct movement takes you. I will let you go. As soon as you make a significant technical error, I feel like I need to make you pay for that. And sometimes, again, that's not obvious because people assume that it's just, oh, Rob did that because he's a black belt and he's better than me and he's magical and all the different, like 2 of those things are correct. The last one is not correct. And so I need people to understand that. And if they don't get it like right away, where I don't see the recognition that they were made to pay for an error, I make sure and point that out to them either after the round or during the round.
Yeah, they need to know that they made a mistake, right? We can cater to them and spoon feed them a bunch of stuff. But if they make drastic mistakes, they need to pay for them,
Yeah, and I'd say that's a common language in how we all roll with the students. So that now we're talking about even outside of the, the actual verbal language, we're talking about a physical language of how we as coaches approach training rounds with students.
Got it. I think that this is something that is tremendously important. And I really like the emphasis on explaining to people, not just being the mat enforcer, because I think that approach is old school and kind of gross and honestly doesn't really work, right? If your way of teaching your student is just to, if they're going too hard for you then to just ramp it up and beat the crap out of them, that's kind of like, perpetuating the cycle of violence. You're not really teaching the person to slow down. You're just teaching the person that when they get to your rank level, their job is to do the same to the new guy. Whereas I think, again, as a parent, using your words is very important, and it's very critical to make people know that the goal of this is not to win the round. The goal of this is for everyone to get better. I also really love that saying of yours, Rob, that we're not here to fight each other. We're here to fight injuries. I think that's a really catchy and important way to get the message across. Something I really like about the way that you guys specifically choose language too is I find that the way that you guys choose terminology, it is just a bit catchy and it's a bit memorable. It sticks in the mind. This is, Rob, why I co-opt a lot of your language and promote it on BJJ Mental Models so much. And I sometimes use like Danaher speak, but not often. And the reason why is because I find if I'm talking to other dumbasses like myself, I want to use a common language that everyone can understand. I don't want to have to pull out a thesaurus or a translator to get people to know what I'm talking about. Do you put a lot of thought into not just the words you choose, but kind of the stickiness of those words, the marketing aspect about how to say something in such a way that it resonates with people?
For sure. I mean, I wouldn't say that I put a lot of effort into like the marketing aspect of it. I think that over the years as an instructor, my goal is always to be, a better teacher the following year than I was the previous year. And one of the things, because I'm a, more than slightly odd and somewhat cerebral guy, my personal language, the way I would choose to communicate with people is not the ideal language for communicating with most people. Like if I have a conversation with a fellow nerd and we get into the weeds on like the physics or the biomechanics and all that kind of stuff, that's great. And I certainly do think it's beneficial to use at least the universal language of physics and biomechanics when describing the things that we need to describe in those terms. But in terms of the less tangible stuff, especially the stuff that we've just been talking about the last few minutes, that kind of like overly technical, or not even overly, but just that kind of technical language isn't super beneficial. So like my process in growing as a coach has been trying to use more relatable language to people. And I also do have like an off-color sense of humor. So there is a bit of dovetailing there where like, if I can't use a technical term, then I can call someone a dingus for trying to win the drill. So yeah, there's definitely been a concerted effort on my part to try to use language that will stick in your ear, either because of the, if we're talking about like the taint sweep or the dick post, like, slightly off color, or just like the idea of using phrases like we're fighting injuries, we're not fighting each other, that kind of stuff. It might not be the way that I personally would choose to express myself, but it's far, far more important. And this is where you get into like, do you want to be a good coach or a good teacher, or do you want to seem like a good teacher to idiots? And if your only way of communicating is to speak down to people, that's more about convincing other people that you're smarter than they are than it is about being an effective teacher or communicator. So I've really tried to let any notions like that go and try to meet people where they are in terms of that kind of common language, using the vernacular of the streets a little bit more than the vernacular of academia. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess we could call that the vernacular, right?
There you go. It is shocking how easy it is to turn my last name into a portmanteau, I've found.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what you're touching, what you're saying there, this is something that we've talked about, and I think people probably know what my agenda is on this. Our mutual friend, Dave Porter, came on this podcast a while back and gave a whole treatise on why we as coaches need to simplify our language. I think that one of the things about jiu-jitsu is that right now, over the last few years, it feels like it's been in this state of complexification. Everyone's been trying to figure out how can we make this thing more complicated. What I observe, though, from a lot of the other more established sports is they're always going in the other direction. How can we make this simpler and distill things down? And I think part of that, like you said, comes down to, hey, are you trying to be an effective coach or are you trying to look smart? And those are two very different things, and that's going to impact how you choose to communicate to your students, to your audience, whoever they may be.
Well, I think complexity is good for some things. So like the degree to which somebody understands something, I think can be really simplified to the amount of distinctions they are capable of making, right? Like if I go to cook something and I'm like, that is meat, I will burn that meat. That's why I'm not a chef. There are degrees of distinctions that, chefs or cooks, whatever, can make on, stuff that I'm frankly not even able to slightly remark on. There are ways of describing any activity that the more distinctions and refinements you can make, the more you know about it. But that doesn't necessarily translate in the moment to communicating that to someone. So I think that to be a coach or an instructor, you want to have the complexity kind of in the background in your brain where you can access it if you need to go down the rabbit hole with someone. Like if Gary and I sit down and try to discuss berimbolos, it's going to sound very different than if I'm trying to get a blue belt to get to the point of inverting and using legs as levers to get to the back a little bit. Like there will be a way more simplified conversation. So I think that when we're trying to get somebody from beginner to expert in something, we're going from very basic terminology to more complex terminology. But then when we go back to having that expert try to execute in competition, if I was talking to Gary about barambolos in a class, that will sound, again, very different than if I was trying to coach Gary in a tournament to complete a berimbolo, in which case I'd be going right back to very simple, basic, like biomechanical cues. You know, make sure your knee is at the hip, make sure your end of the lever, knee in front of hip, like very basic stuff. So I think the complexity stuff has value for in-depth technical discussions where we're trying to figure out maybe a different or better way of doing something, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the simple stuff is much better for teaching beginners to intermediate people and then going back to coaching regardless of the level in competition in the heat of battle. Does that make sense? Is it like the sliding scale of how technical, how complex we want our language to be?
100%. I mean, in my fields, one of the sayings is make it as simple as it can be, but not too simple, right? You want it to be as complicated as it needs to be and no more complicated than that. Complexity is not inherently bad when the complexity serves a purpose and it's still the simplest way to communicate what you're trying to communicate. I mean, there's some concepts that are just so inherently complicated that even if you simplify them down as much as you can, it's still going to be complicated. And at that point, if you simplify any further, you run the risk of actually losing the key of the message. So you always want it to be as simple as you can make it without losing important fidelity, but no simpler than that.
I totally agree. And I do think, like, on a fundamental level, even when we were talking about the concepts and we're using like physics language, we're still trying to boil it down to idiot speak. It's a frame or a lever. You know, if you can't understand a lever, man, go back to high school. The fact that people refer to some of the language that I use as being like super technical or complex, or it's like, fuck, what is the level of schooling in our society when somebody just saying, hey guys, let's talk about a frame, a lever, and a wedge, and that gets referred to as complex terminology? Like, these are simple machines. I'm not trying to get people to understand the fucking Large Hadron Collider over here. It's a fucking wedge, guys, right? So like the fact that that is considered complex in jiu-jitsu is a little bit of a failing testament to like the level of stupid in our sport, because we're never trying to introduce unnecessary complexity into the equation.
Yeah, I use it as like complexity is like stepping stones, right? When I'm teaching a day one beginner, everything is going to be dumbed down to the absolute minimum. And as you progress, the stepping stones, you keep stepping, you keep learning more, you keep learning more and more and more. And then the language changes between, like Rob said, if I'm having a conversation with Gary, it's a lot different than if I'm having a conversation with one of the white belts in the 101 class or one of the blue belts in the 201 class. Vastly differs between individuals and skills and, you know, people that have been around the academy for as long as they have. Like my conversation with, I'm just going to keep using Gary as my example, with Gary is a lot more island top team based than if my conversation with, I'm just going to say Dave from down the block, just it's drastically different, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, when you're talking to an individual, it's especially if you know them well, almost exclusively if you know them well. Like I know what Cory's knowledge base is like. I have an idea. So it's easier for me to build onto that, where I get to start at a higher place. I might be able to get into a deeper spot. But when we're talking to an entire room, especially if, you know, you're teaching a beginner's class or something like that, it's like we got to dial it back. And I think as, you know, people who have made it our work here to nerd out on a particular thing, it's very tempting to talk about the things that, you know, excite you in the moment, right? Like I'm excited about certain techniques and certain technical details or whatever, but that's not what the room needs to hear about right now, right? Like it's very tempting if I show a move and I know some new details for myself about it to get really in and focus in on that. But at the end of the day, most people in that room are going to gain the most from us talking about just the underlying concepts. And if as I'm walking around watching the room work on that, I see one of the advanced groups, maybe I drop a couple details into that group specifically as to not kind of overwhelm the new people. You know, if it's your first week and I'm adding the thing I just learned after over a decade, like that's probably not appropriate. In some cases, of course, it would be, right, if I'm replacing something that was bad. But I think it's just tempting sometimes. I have this internal battle with myself of talking about what they need to hear, not the parts of it that interest me right now because I'm thinking about them.
And that just goes back to that point of like everything about that previous statement reveals how much Gary cares about being a better coach rather than impressing upon people how much he knows. One of the other aspects of like a common language, so we've discussed the common language that we're using in communicating with our students. One of the or two terms that I try to use, and these are more, although I do, like I will use them in talking to students, but they're more terms that I use with my coaches. So we talk about cognitive load and we talk about assumed knowledge. And when you're speaking to a room of white belts, the level of assumed knowledge is going to be drastically lower than, a room full of purple belts, right? Like I just taught a seminar at the Northwest No-Gi Summit in Portland a couple days ago, and I don't think there was a single white belt in the room. If there was, they were a fairly experienced white belt. So like the seminar was on arm drags, and I was like, hey, show of hands, who's done an arm drag here before? Okay, everyone has. So that was great because the amount of assumed knowledge that I could start out with, we just got to skip the first 10, 15 minutes at least of what would have been me explaining, the concept of an arm drag and how it works and this and that and that. So like that amount of assumed knowledge, it's a huge accelerator for me in how I was able to present that seminar. If I had a different audience, I would have to present that seminar differently. So just understanding this idea of assumed knowledge on the part of a purple belt versus the assumed knowledge on the part of a white belt. When we're discussing things as coaches as to how do we want to proceed, we always need to be really aware of what is the assumed knowledge of the people in the room, and based on that, what is the cognitive load going to be? So like when do we choose as coaches, because we do communicate to our students the idea of cognitive load. If there's a certain level of assumed knowledge in the room and that assumed knowledge is higher, we can wait longer to bring up the idea of cognitive load. Whereas if it's more of a one-on-one class, we've got to tell them a lot earlier on, like, hey guys, okay, now's the time where you want to become aware of your cognitive load. And maybe if you're a one stripe white belt, don't worry about learning the next thing or two that I'm going to show. Just worry about the first two things we worked on. Whereas, if you're a 2-3 stripe white belt, you're still in a one-on-one class for whatever reason, you can go ahead and learn all four movements and it's not really going to impact your cognitive load very much. So those are, that's another aspect of like a common language that we want to have as far as like the front facing, the customer facing common language. And then we've got the management employee facing common language that we want to have. And there are probably other common language that we have in referring to our customers that we don't want to make public, but those two I'm very willing to make public.
Yeah, I like that detail of getting there early with the cognitive load thing. Because like I found, especially recently, this is something I've noticed, is that like you do have to kind of get there before you would think you need to get there. What I mean by that is just like letting them know like, hey, let's slow it down if you're having trouble with this. Because if you take it to, let's say we're showing very, very simple concepts and then there's something that goes a little too far. If I wait till right before it goes too far, everybody in the room kind of assumes they've got it when they don't, right? So I find like you do have to get there almost before you should, just to like almost drop that idea in their head as like, hey, we're going to get complicated now. And then you kind of keep it a little simple for maybe one more move and then get a little deeper. Because, yeah, otherwise people tend to go, I've got that move. I half did it kind of right once. Let's move on to the next one. And so it's good to kind of get ahead of that and be like, let's slow down, maybe rep that other one out. Because a lot of these things, the majority of your results are going to be from the base movements, right? And you can't build on top of that unless those are correct.
Yeah, it's always okay to dial it back. You never have to go too far. It's easier just to stay on the base movement and try to perfect that. You always need more reps on that anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably something that, again, like over time, I've learned to teach less. I give less overall information, less detail, give people more opportunities to explore the movements and understand why a particular approach might be correct or incorrect. And hopefully, especially because both Cory and Gary have been at the club since the beginning. So I think they've probably seen that progression and seen how much better the teaching is when you actually do less and worry less about showing people how much you know versus worrying more about just like, how do I get the information across in the most efficient way? That's something that's, another commonality that we'll have is like, we all know that we don't have to impress you with a bunch of details. We'd rather keep it simple, and we'd rather just take a little bit more time to reiterate the thing that we're working on than feel like we've got to speed up the rate of learning.
Yeah, I really noticed with Rob, this isn't necessarily super recent, but it's one of the more recent things that I have noticed in the evolution of his teaching is the focus on like the mechanism being what we're thinking about for the room. What I mean by that is like, instead of saying, hey, today we're working on back attacks, it'll be like, today we're working on rotational control. How does that relate to the back? And somebody who's watching him not just to get better at jiu-jitsu, but I'm also in the room to learn how to teach better, right? And seeing that and seeing how well it works for me, looking around and seeing how people who haven't been doing this as long as I have are still getting so much out of it, of thinking of the back, let's say, as, well, we're behind somebody, we're trying to control rotation. Of course, that's what we're doing. And it sounds really simple, but when you really distill it down and instead of focusing on those tiny details, it just makes such a big difference.
Yeah. The big thing that you guys are saying here, which is really resonating with me, is that when you're communicating with people, you need to think about not what do I want to say or not how do I want to be heard, but really how can I best reach this other person on the other side? I think that too many instructors look at teaching through their own lens of what they want to do and what they want to see out of their students, but don't really look at it through the lens of, a paying customer, a person who's in here who is not nearly as experienced as you. They've got their own goals. They've got their own level that they're at, their own challenges and their own areas that they're good at. And you kind of need to meet them where they are if you want to really reach them. I see this a lot doing a primarily audio product, right? I find that many jiu-jitsu coaches, when you take video away from them, they really struggle to teach people because so much of what they do is they'll show something with their hands and their feet and they'll just tell everyone basically, just copy what I did, right? They're just narrating what they're doing from their own perspective. Whereas if you create language and you consider the level of your student and you reach out to them, what you often find is, you're talking at a much simpler level than maybe you would like to talk at, but that's the basis of good communication, is reaching people where they are. So I always like to, on this podcast, it's kind of fun because I get to skill check a lot of people. I can see if I take away the visual medium and you have to actually communicate with people to teach them jiu-jitsu, what do you have left in your arsenal? Can you still do it? And I find that this to me is a really good test of, is someone a good jiu-jitsu coach? If they can come on here and get their ideas across without the crutch of visuals, I can assume that they probably have a pretty good handle on what they're doing.
How do I reach these kids?
I like to think of it as just being in the people business, not so much as jiu-jitsu. Each person has like a more individual need. So like, that's where I kind of shine in class, is I can resonate with almost every single person. And I kind of have an idea of what they need the best you can, right? Like you can't know everything that's going on in everybody's lives at all times, but I'm very good with connecting with the students and understanding where maybe they're struggling, what's going on in their life, or blah, 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 all that stuff. And when that comes down like to the language side of things, is it allows me to connect with them a lot easier.
Yeah, that's something that Cory really excels at. And like in terms of my skill set, that's a pretty sorely lacking skill. It's something I've tried to improve, but just because of the fact that I don't connect with people as much, it's not going to be something I'm ever excellent at. I try to get better at it, obviously, but having Cory as like the person in the gym that can fill that role so well has been, I know this isn't necessarily about like common language, but like if we're talking about how do we, most effectively meet people's needs, well, that's one of the ways that we can do that, is that, my role may be to meet certain needs. With Cory talks about he's in the people business. I am very much in the jiu-jitsu business, right? So that way we can be, as an entity, as a club, as a group of coaches, we can be in the people business and the jiu-jitsu business and be able to address people's needs on the high level of jiu-jitsu that we offer, but we can also address people's needs with the people aspect of it. And between the three of us right now, or the four of us when Rory's around, whatever, we can really try to find a way to meet everybody's needs, because the jiu-jitsu stuff is part of it, the people stuff is a huge part of it, And if I was left to my own devices, the people stuff definitely would not get done anywhere nearly as well as it gets done with Cory here.
That's a great plug for you, Cory. But, I agree with you completely there, Rob. And I think that you've touched on an important part of team building. People often think, man, what are the things I'm not good at and how can I become great at them? And sometimes you have to do that, but not always. Sometimes, especially if you've got a team, the best dynamic is find people who can fill in the missing puzzle piece for you and let them do that job, right? If you try to focus obsessively on everything you're not amazing at, often what winds up happening is you become kind of mediocre at everything. Sometimes, if you're a specialist, it's best to just focus on the things you're good at and expand the team to cover the areas where maybe you're lacking. And that way, everyone gets to play to their strong suit.
Yeah, I agree. I think you just described me as an excellent team leader. Thank you.
Fuck. Well, man, I really like these kinds of chats. I think it's great to have a roundtable of coaches here. This is something I don't get to really cover much because I'm not an on-the-ground jiu-jitsu coach. I'm basically a talking head. But any closing thoughts, Rob, Cory, Gary, anything else that we want to get into here on this topic of coaching language that we didn't explore yet?
Yeah, other than to recapitulate, no, I mean, because we did actually, we got into more different aspects of common language than I actually thought we were going to. I kind of had anticipated that we would mostly be discussing the common language of the concepts that we use when teaching. And we managed to get into, the common language of the creating an atmosphere, the common language that we use as coaches in the background, the common language of rolling. There's so much to this topic. And I think that basically we're trying to create is, and this is something, not that I want to get, again, too far off topic, but the problems that we see as a society nowadays are very much connected to the fact that, to some degree at least, different groups of people no longer occupy the same reality. And part of that is down to language. And part of that is down to just denying reality. And so the more that we can create in our gyms a shared reality, because of the language we use, we view jiu-jitsu the same way, right? Steve, you referred to the meathead gyms. The shared reality of a meathead gym is so different than the shared reality of our gym. The shared reality of a meathead gym is you have to go there and be prepared to be injured on any given day. You basically have to make it through a meat grinder to have any hope of being good at jiu-jitsu. And so there's a type of person that's just never going to make it through that, either temperamentally or just physically. And so, the world is being denied the opportunity to see the beauty of someone's jiu-jitsu if the only common language that certain gyms have, or that all gyms would have, would be this meathead, sink or swim kind of language, which was that was the shared reality of jiu-jitsu for the first several decades, probably. And now we've got the shared reality of our gym. You've got the shared reality of, maybe a 10th Planet gym where people who would come to just my gym wouldn't necessarily feel totally welcomed by that. And you've got the shared reality of a Gracie Baja where, the head instructor isn't going to swear. And so there are people who would not maybe be comfortable with our shared reality. And so the fact that we're able to create a shared reality in a bunch of different gyms, we don't need a universal shared reality or shared language across the board in jiu-jitsu. What we need is just enough of a shared reality, which is what we have, which is jiu-jitsu is choking and breaking people and controlling them and all that. We kind of all know what we're doing. And we can all have our, as long as we share that overall reality, the language and the shared reality that we can create in different gyms allows different people to thrive. And so the greater variety of people that can find a gym where the language works for them, when the language speaks to them, the more people out there like that, the more people overall we can have doing jiu-jitsu, which means the more brains we have contributing to solving the problems that arise in jiu-jitsu, which means jiu-jitsu is just going to get that much better. So I think as long as we share an overall shared reality, all of us doing jiu-jitsu, where we can agree that this is what we're doing, and the more precise language we can use to describe that reality, the more we can have environments in different clubs that appeal to more people. And I think the sport benefits from that. I think the industry benefits from that. I think all of us as participants benefit from that, in having multiple options for a club that can become a home for them. And I think that's the benefit of finding this common language.
Amazing, man. Well, I think this is fantastic. As we tie this up, if this all sounds good to people, Rob, of course, people can come visit you in Island Top Team if they're in the area, but I know you've also got a growing affiliation of gyms around the world, really. So people might not have to make it all the way to Vancouver Island if they want to train with you. Why don't you plug the gym and the affiliation and just talk about the status of what you're working on?
Yeah, so our affiliation continues to grow. We have affiliates that have been announced, but affiliates that also haven't yet been announced. So we've got a couple of announcements that we'll be making later on in the year as far as clubs in the US that will have joined our network. But as of right now, we've got a good cluster of clubs in the Pacific Northwest, both here in BC on the mainland, here on the island. There's a couple of clubs that are kind of affiliated with us, a couple of clubs in on the Sunshine Coast, the Vancouver area, a club in Seattle named Panda Roll. We've got Swim, Solarte BJJ, so that's sort of the Pacific Northwest. We've got a Minnesota affiliate, Dranger Jiu-Jitsu. We've got Theory Jiu-Jitsu in Wisconsin now. Again, we've got a couple announcements we'll be making later on in the year. We've got an Australian affiliate in Melbourne. We've got a Chinese affiliate in Nanjing. We've got Calgary in Alberta, Canada, Affinity. So we've got a lot of places that you can go where you can learn our shit. And if you can't go to those places or you can't come visit us, you can always go to bjjconcepts.net or .com and sign up for our online academy and learn a common language that we can all speak.
Amazing, man. Well, I mean, I know that I plug this all the time, but if you are looking for a complete video academy that talks about things from a conceptual approach, Rob's site, BJJ Concepts, is always my number one recommendation, always has been. So if you're not already a member, I definitely recommend going and checking it out. bjjconcepts.net. I'll put a link to all of that stuff in the show notes. I'll also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Man, hundreds of episodes of this thing now. All of them are intended to be timeless capsule episodes. Each of them are intended to have a lesson. So you should be able to go back to the first episode in the queue and still get value out of those. We've also got our awesome newsletter, getting close to 12,000 people signed up to that, completely free. And of course, if you want to support us and take it up to the next level with us, BJJ Mental Models Premium is how you do that. If you join that, you're going to get a massive audio course library, plus premium exclusive podcasts that you can only find on there, plus access to our community. If you go up to our coaching or our business tiers, we can even help support you by providing rolling reviews or by actually helping provide business services as well. So please do check that out. First week is free if you want to try it. And on the topic of extra podcasts, Rob, are we in a state now where we can disclose the news here? Do we want to talk about this?
I mean, certainly if people like this episode, if people are like, fuck, that was boring to listen to, maybe when we disclose this, it's a little bit premature. But yeah, I mean, I think Cory, Gary, and I are going to be getting together once a month and trying to do a bit of a coaching podcast for the premium listeners.
That's right. So we're going to have that. That's going to be added to the family of podcasts there. I mean, BJJ Mental Models itself, as we've grown, has kind of become this broad spectrum, general purpose jiu-jitsu podcast. And as a result, sometimes we don't have a chance to deep dive into specific things. So on the premium service, we've been rolling out a ton of new podcasts with the intent of covering those areas. So for example, if you're a performance athlete, Emily Kwok's podcast is on there. If you're interested in studying the competition meta, Drew Foster's podcast is on there. We've got an upcoming unannounced business podcast as well that's going to be coming. And I mean, the one thing that I always get asked about is coaching. I'm not an on-the-ground full-time coach, but I can't think of anyone better than Rob and his team to speak about that. So we're going to be hosting that podcast coming pretty soon. But man, Rob, Cory, Gary, thanks so much for coming by. And Cory, Gary, as first-timers, man, I loved having you here. It's great to get kind of a holistic perspective of what happens at the gym. You guys know I've been a big fan of your affiliation for, man, feels like forever at this point. So thanks so much for coming by to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for having us, man.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thanks a lot, everyone. And thanks to the listeners, of course. We really do appreciate everyone hanging out here with us, and we'll talk to you next time. See you soon.